The street was alive with activity. Upscale shops lined both sides, their brightly lit displays showcasing the latest in luxury fashion and accessories. Expensive cars, their paint gleaming under the afternoon sun, idled along the curb as well-dressed drivers waited for their passengers. Pedestrians hurried past, many clutching shopping bags from high-end boutiques, their conversations filled with talk of exotic vacations, fine dining, and the latest trends. Amid the bustle, Elena strode confidently down the sidewalk. Her designer heels clicked sharply against the pavement, her head held high as she adjusted her oversized sunglasses. She wore a perfectly tailored dress that seemed to announce her wealth without needing words. In her manicured hands, she carried several branded shopping bags, each bearing the logo of an exclusive store. Elena moved with purpose, her steps brisk and determined, her expression radiating the satisfaction of someone who knew she belonged in this world of opulence. At the edge of the sidewalk, just outside the entrance of a luxury boutique, a man sat on the ground. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, his shoes worn from years of use. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was a calmness about him, as if he were unaffected by the world rushing past. His name was David, though few people cared to ask. He sat cross-legged, a small cardboard sign resting in front of him with the words, "Just need a little help. Thank you." David's gaze was steady, his kind eyes observing the passers-by without judgment. He didn't call out to anyone, didn't extend his hand in desperation. Instead, when someone approached, he offered a polite smile and a quiet word of thanks to those who spared a glance or dropped loose change into the small cup beside him. As Elena approached, David noticed her, but his expression didn't change. He waited until she was a few steps away before speaking, his voice calm and polite. "Ma'am," he said, looking up at her, "could you help me get something to eat?" Elena paused mid-step, turning her head sharply to look at him. Her eyebrows arched above her sunglasses, and for a moment there was only silence between them. Then she let out a short, sharp laugh, as if he had just told a particularly amusing joke. "Get something to eat?" she repeated, her voice dripping with incredulity. "Why don't you get a job instead of sitting here and begging people like me for handouts?" David's expression didn't falter. He simply nodded, his smile faint but steady. "Thank you for your advice," he replied softly, his tone devoid of sarcasm or bitterness. Elena, however, wasn't finished. She adjusted the strap of her bag and gestured at the bustling street around them. "Look at all these people working hard, earning their way," she said loudly, her voice carrying over the hum of conversation and traffic. "You think they got to where they are by sitting on the ground and waiting for someone to feel sorry for them?" A few bystanders turned their heads at the sound of her voice. Some glanced at David with fleeting sympathy before hurrying on their way. Others looked at Elena, their expressions a mix of discomfort and disapproval, though no one intervened. David simply nodded again, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I understand," he said, his voice still polite. "I hope you have a wonderful day." Elena scoffed, shaking her head as if dismissing the entire interaction. "People like you," she muttered, her tone laced with disdain before turning on her heel and walking away. The air seemed to hang heavy for a moment as Elena entered the boutique, the door swinging shut behind her. David remained where he was, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze once again steady as he watched the flow of pedestrians pass by. Inside the boutique, Elena was greeted warmly by the staff, their smiles bright and welcoming. She began browsing the shelves, chatting animatedly about the items she had already purchased and the trips she was planning. Outside, David sat quietly, occasionally nodding his thanks to those who stopped to drop coins into his cup. Though the encounter had passed, it lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. A mother walking with her young son glanced back at David, her brow furrowed in thought. A clerk stepping out of the store for a break hesitated before re-entering, her gaze flicking between the man on the sidewalk and the woman inside. David remained as he had been before Elena approached, calm, composed, and quietly observing the world around him. But the brief interaction had left a ripple in its wake, setting the stage for something much larger than anyone could have predicted. David remained seated on the ground, his expression calm and unbothered, even after Elena's sharp words. He nodded slightly and offered a quiet, "Thank you," as she turned to walk away. However, her steps faltered as if his composure had somehow irritated her further. She pivoted back toward him, her designer heels clicking sharply on the pavement, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Thank you?" she repeated, her tone dripping with mockery. "You don't even know what you're thanking me for." She crossed her arms, her shopping bags swaying at her sides. "Honestly, people like you just waste everyone's time. Sitting here all day expecting the rest of us to work hard so you can live off handouts. It's pathetic." David tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged. "I appreciate your honesty," he said, his voice soft but steady. Elena's eyes narrowed. She seemed almost offended by his refusal to engage, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to her rising irritation. "You're just going to sit there and act polite while you mooch off others?" she scoffed. Her voice carried over the noise of the street, drawing the attention of passers-by. A young mother, walking with her child, slowed down slightly, her brows knitting together as she glanced at Elena, then at David. She quickly looked away and hurried her child along, but the discomfort in her posture was clear. A store clerk stepping outside for a moment froze in place, her eyes darting between the pair before she silently stepped back inside, avoiding the scene altogether. David didn't react to the growing audience. He simply nodded again, his hands resting calmly on his knees. "I hope you have a good day," he said, his voice carrying a quiet sincerity that seemed to clash with Elena's escalating anger. "Good day?" Elena repeated, her laugh sharp and cold. "Do you really think you're in any position to be wishing anyone a good day?" She gestured to the luxury boutiques lining the street. "This is the real world. If you want to survive, you work for it. You don't sit around waiting for someone else to feel sorry for you." David didn't answer. His silence only seemed to fuel Elena's frustration. She rolled her eyes and let out an exasperated sigh, muttering, "Unbelievable," before finally turning and heading toward the boutique she had been walking toward earlier. Inside the store, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. The polished floors gleamed under the soft lighting, and rows of designer handbags and shoes were displayed like pieces of art. A store associate approached Elena with a practiced smile, greeting her warmly. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the associate said. "How can I assist you today?" Elena's demeanor shifted instantly. Her irritation melted into a smug smile as she adjusted the strap of her handbag and glanced around the store. "Just browsing," she replied, her tone light and casual. "I've already picked up a few things today. These bags are proof of that." She held up her shopping bags with a flourish as though they were trophies. The associate nodded politely, but there was a faint flicker of something in her expression. Perhaps discomfort or something close to pity. Still, she remained professional and gestured toward a display of new arrivals. "Of course, ma'am. Please let me know if you'd like to see anything closer." As Elena browsed the shelves, she began chatting animatedly with another associate. Her voice carried through the store, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "It's such a shame," she said, glancing briefly toward the window, "that the city allows people like him to loiter around here. It's bad for business, don't you think?" The associate hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. "Well, ma'am," she began cautiously, "I suppose everyone has their struggles." "Struggles?" Elena repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Please, struggles are what you overcome, not what you use as an excuse to sit around and do nothing." She waved a dismissive hand. "Anyway, back to these shoes. Do you have them in a size 7? While Elena tried on shoes and debated between colors, David remained seated outside. The flow of pedestrians had slowed slightly, and fewer people seemed willing to make eye contact with him. Still, he stayed where he was, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. At one point, an older man walking by paused briefly and dropped a few coins into David's cup. "Stay safe, son," the man said quietly before walking on. David nodded in thanks, his faint smile unchanged. Through the large glass windows of the boutique, David could see Elena moving from display to display, her gestures animated as she spoke to the staff. He noticed the way she laughed, her head tilted back slightly, her voice carrying even through the thick glass. There was no malice in his gaze, no bitterness or anger, only a quiet curiosity, as though he were observing a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. As the minutes passed, a sleek black car rolled slowly down the street. The driver, dressed in a crisp uniform, glanced toward David before the car pulled into a nearby parking spot. David turned his head slightly in acknowledgement, but his expression remained neutral. Back inside, Elena had finally made her selections. She approached the counter with an air of triumph, placing her chosen items down with a flourish. "I'll take these," she said confidently, reaching into her handbag for her wallet. The associate at the register began ringing up the items, the sound of the scanner breaking the quiet hum of the store. Elena handed over her credit card with a practiced smile, her confidence unshaken. But the smile faltered as the associate swiped the card, frowned slightly, and tried again. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the associate said after a moment. "It seems there's an issue with your card." Elena's brow furrowed in confusion. "That's impossible," she said sharply. "Try it again." The associate hesitated but did as instructed. After the third attempt, she leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "It might be best to contact your bank, ma'am," she suggested. Elena's face flushed with embarrassment, though she quickly masked it with irritation. "I'll pay cash," she snapped, pulling a few large bills from her wallet and tossing them onto the counter. As the associate completed the transaction, Elena glanced toward the window and noticed David still sitting outside. For a brief moment, her gaze lingered on him, and something flickered in her expression, perhaps frustration, perhaps something deeper. Outside, David sat unmoving, his eyes steady and his faint smile unchanged. He watched as Elena stepped out of the boutique, her arms still laden with shopping bags. Their eyes met briefly, but neither said a word. The tension lingered in the air as Elena walked away, her head held high. David remained where he was, quietly observing, his calm demeanor unshaken despite the sharp contrast in their interactions. The passers-by who had witnessed the earlier exchange glanced at him occasionally, their expressions a mix of sympathy and unease. Though nothing seemed to have changed outwardly, the seeds of something greater had been planted. A quiet shift, unnoticed by most, but significant nonetheless. The events of the day were far from over, and the story was only beginning to unfold. David sat quietly on the pavement, His posture unchanged despite the bustling activity around him. The sunlight shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the sidewalk. He appeared entirely unbothered by his surroundings, the faint, almost meditative smile still gracing his face. A middle-aged man walking past slowed his steps, his attention drawn to the calm figure on the ground. The man, dressed in a well-tailored suit, hesitated before stopping a few feet from David. His gaze flicked to the small cardboard sign, then to David's calm expression. "Having a rough day, huh?" the man asked, his tone cautious but not unkind. David looked up, meeting the man's gaze with an unshaken steadiness. "Just a day like any other," he replied, his voice soft but confident. The man glanced at the storefronts lining the street. "Not a bad spot to be, I guess," he remarked, gesturing toward the luxury boutiques. "Quite the view." David's smile deepened slightly, his eyes following the man's gesture. "Yes," he agreed. "That, window display over there," he said, nodding toward a boutique nearby, "features the latest season's collection. The design work on that handbag is impressive, hand-stitched with imported Italian leather. And the shoes? Limited edition. Only 30 pairs made." The man's brows lifted in surprise. "You seem to know quite a bit about these things," he said, his tone curious. David shrugged lightly. "I've always appreciated craftsmanship," he replied, his words laced with subtle meaning. The man studied him for a moment, an unspoken question lingering in his expression. Then, with a small nod, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, placing them gently in David's cup. "Take care of yourself," he said before walking away. David's quiet "thank you" followed him, though the man didn't turn back. Moments later, the low hum of an approaching car broke the steady rhythm of footsteps on the pavement. A sleek black vehicle, its windows tinted and its paint gleaming under the sun, rolled slowly down the street. It moved with deliberate precision, its engine barely audible. As the car passed, the chauffeur glanced toward the sidewalk where David sat. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, and the chauffeur gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before continuing down the road. David acknowledged the gesture with the faintest incline of his head. His calm demeanor remained unchanged, but the moment was not lost on a young woman standing nearby who had paused to adjust her bag. She looked between David and the car, her brows knitting together in quiet curiosity. Inside the boutique, Elena's frustration was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. She stood at the counter, her lips pressed into a thin line as the store associate swiped her credit card for the third time. "I don't understand," Elena said sharply, her voice low but laced with irritation. "There shouldn't be any problem with my card. Try it again." The associate hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I've already tried multiple times, ma'am," she replied, her tone cautious. "Perhaps it's a connection issue, or there might be something you need to check with your bank." Elena's face flushed slightly, and she quickly glanced around the store. Although the other customers appeared engrossed in their shopping, she felt as though all eyes were on her. She leaned closer to the associate, lowering her voice. "Are you saying my card was declined?" The associate nodded slightly. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Elena straightened, her embarrassment quickly masked by indignation. "It's not an inconvenience," she snapped, reaching into her handbag to retrieve another card. "It's a mistake, and it's one you'd better fix." The associate accepted the new card with a tight-lipped smile, her movements careful and deliberate as she swiped it. This time, the transaction went through, but the tension in Elena's posture didn't ease. She gathered her purchases with a huff, ignoring the quiet murmurs of the staff as she exited the store. Stepping back onto the sidewalk, Elena's gaze instinctively sought out David. He was still seated in the same spot, his expression as calm as ever. The sight of him, so unbothered, so serene, seemed to reignite the irritation simmering beneath her polished exterior. She approached him, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "Still here?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Of course you are. People like you never move unless someone forces you to." David looked up at her, his faint smile unshaken. "You seem upset," he said quietly. "Upset?" Elena repeated, letting out a short, bitter laugh. "Why would I be upset? I just spent more on a single pair of shoes than you probably make in a year." David tilted his head slightly, studying her with an expression that was almost sympathetic. "That must be nice," he said simply. Elena blinked, caught off guard by his response. For a moment she seemed unsure of what to say. Then she shook her head and turned away, muttering something under her breath as she stalked off down the street. David watched her go, his expression calm but thoughtful. He glanced down at the cup beside him, where a few new bills and coins had been added since the morning. The quiet clinking of change punctuated the steady rhythm of the city around him. As the minutes passed, another passerby, a woman in her 40s wearing a simple but elegant dress, paused briefly in front of David. She smiled faintly and said, "You have kind eyes." David looked up at her, his smile widening slightly. "Thank you," he said. The woman hesitated for a moment before reaching into her bag and pulling out a small wrapped sandwich. "It's not much," she said, placing it beside him. "But I hope it helps." David nodded in gratitude. "It helps more than you know," he replied. The woman walked away, her steps light and unhurried. David unwrapped the sandwich slowly, taking a small bite as he glanced down the street. The black car from earlier had returned, parked discreetly at the corner. Its presence seemed almost deliberate, though no one else appeared to notice. Inside the car, the chauffeur adjusted his rearview mirror, his gaze briefly meeting David's once more. This time, there was a subtle exchange, a quiet acknowledgement, almost as though they were communicating without words. David's calm demeanor remained unchanged, but the layers of his identity were beginning to peel back, one small moment at a time. Meanwhile, Elena, still bristling from her encounter with David, stopped at another store farther down the street. Her irritation was palpable as she rifled through racks of clothing, barely glancing at the items she pulled aside. "Ma'am, is there something specific you're looking for?" a sales associate asked politely. "Just something worth my time," Elena snapped, not bothering to meet the associate's gaze. The associate stepped back slightly, her expression neutral but her movements careful. Elena's irritation only deepened as she continued browsing, her thoughts returning repeatedly to the man she had dismissed on the sidewalk. Something about his calmness had unsettled her, his unshaken demeanor, his quiet confidence. It was as though he knew something she didn't, and the thought gnawed at her despite her efforts to brush it aside. Back on the sidewalk, David finished the sandwich and carefully folded the wrapper, placing it in his cup along with the loose change. He adjusted his posture slightly, leaning back against the wall with a sigh of contentment. The day was far from over, but the air around him seemed to hum with unspoken tension, as though something unseen was beginning to shift. The afternoon sun hung lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the busy street. David remained seated in his usual spot, his quiet presence barely acknowledged by the hurried passers-by. His cup of change jingled softly as a few more coins were dropped in by occasional strangers. Despite the mundane rhythm of the day, there was a subtle shift in the air, a quiet anticipation that seemed to surround him. A few moments later, a man dressed in an impeccable dark suit emerged from a nearby car. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he approached David with purposeful steps. The man, carrying a sleek leather portfolio, stopped directly in front of him and inclined his head respectfully. "Mr. Hayes," the man said in a calm, professional tone. "I apologize for the delay. The meeting has been rescheduled for this evening. The board is eager to hear your recommendations." David nodded slightly, his faint smile unchanging. "That's fine, Henry," he replied, his voice measured and confident. "Let them know I'll be there. I trust everything is in order?" Henry gave a curt nod. "Yes, sir. All the documents have been reviewed and finalized. Shall I send the car for you in an hour?" David tilted his head thoughtfully. "Make it 2 hours," he said. "I'd like some time to finish up here." "Of course, sir," Henry replied without hesitation. He handed David a small envelope. "The latest reports from the Foundation, as you requested." David accepted the envelope with a nod. "Thank you, Henry. That will be all for now." As Henry turned to leave, Elena stepped out of a store a few feet away, her arms still laden with shopping bags. Her pace slowed as her eyes locked onto the unexpected scene unfolding before her. She stopped mid-step, her breath catching in her throat. The man she had dismissed so cruelly earlier, the same man she had accused of being lazy and wasting people's time, was now being addressed with deference and respect by a well-dressed professional. "Mr. Hayes?" Elena murmured to herself, the name ringing unfamiliar yet oddly significant. She remained frozen in place, watching as the chauffeur from the sleek black car stepped out and approached David. "Mr. Hayes," the chauffeur said politely, "the car is ready whenever you are." David nodded again, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Thank you. I'll let you know when I'm ready." Elena's mind raced as the pieces began to fit together. She suddenly remembered seeing the black car earlier, the subtle interactions between David and the driver. The envelope Henry had handed him bore the elegant logo of the Hayes Foundation, a name she had seen mentioned in the news before. Her heart sank as realization dawned on her. David wasn't just an ordinary man or even a wealthy one. He was the Hayes Foundation's founder and benefactor, a billionaire known for his extensive philanthropic work. Elena's hands tightened around the straps of her shopping bags. She felt a hot flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck, her earlier words echoing mockingly in her mind. Before she could retreat or compose herself, David turned his gaze toward her. His calm, steady eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You seem surprised," David said gently, his voice carrying a faint trace of amusement. Elena stammered, unable to form a coherent response. I didn't realize." David tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Didn't realize what?" he asked, his tone calm but pointed. Elena's throat tightened. "I didn't realize who you were," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. David's faint smile returned, but there was a weight behind it, a quiet understanding that made her squirm under his gaze. "And if you had?" he asked simply. Elena opened her mouth, but no words came out. She glanced down at the shopping bags in her hands, suddenly feeling their weight more acutely. David continued, his tone steady but firm. "Wealth doesn't define character. How we treat others does." The words hung in the air like a heavy stone dropped into a still pond, rippling outward. Elena felt their impact deeply, her earlier confidence and smugness crumbling in the face of his calm conviction. She began again. but the apology she wanted to form seemed trapped somewhere between her pride and her shame. David watched her for a moment longer, then turned his attention back to the envelope in his hands, his calm demeanor unshaken. "It's easy to judge what we don't understand," he said, his tone softer now but no less firm. "But we all have a choice in how we respond to the world around us." Elena felt her face flush further. She wanted to leave, to walk away, and put as much distance as possible between herself and the weight of her actions. But her feet felt rooted to the ground, her pride refusing to let her retreat without some semblance of an explanation. "I didn't mean to—" she started, but David interrupted her with a gentle shake of his head. "You don't owe me an explanation," he said, his voice kind but resolute. "If you've learned something today, then that's enough." Elena swallowed hard, her eyes darting around as if seeking an escape. The bustling street seemed quieter now, the noise of the world muted by the pounding of her own heart. David rose slowly from his spot, brushing off his hands as he straightened to his full height. He glanced toward the black car where the chauffeur waited patiently by the door. "Goodbye, Elena," he said softly, the use of her name startling her. "I hope your day improves." With that, David walked away, his calm and measured steps carrying him toward the waiting car. Elena stood motionless, her mind racing and her pride shattered, the weight of his words lingering in the air long after he was gone. As the black car pulled away from the curb, Elena remained rooted to the spot, staring after it. The world around her seemed to blur, the reality of her actions crashing over her like a wave. She clutched her shopping bags tightly, their once prized contents now feeling hollow and insignificant. For the first time in a long time, Elena felt truly small, not because of her wealth or lack thereof, but because of the choices she had made. The realization settled heavily in her chest, a quiet but unrelenting reminder of the lesson she had learned. And for David, as he rode away in his car, the events of the day were simply another reminder of why he did what he did, not for recognition, but for the hope that even the smallest moments could inspire change. As the black car disappeared into the flow of traffic, David leaned back in his seat, his calm expression unchanged. His gaze lingered on the world outside the tinted windows, the busy streets filled with people going about their lives. A faint smile played on his lips, not one of triumph or satisfaction, but of quiet understanding. David wasn't testing people for the sake of pride or superiority. His work with the Hayes Foundation had given him a deep insight into the struggles of humanity, and his personal philosophy was simple. Kindness could transform lives in ways that wealth alone never could. He thought back to his earlier conversation with Elena, her shock and shame as she realized who he was. It wasn't the first time someone had judged him based on appearances, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Yet, he didn't hold anger or resentment toward her. He had seen too much of the world to waste energy on such feelings. Later that evening, David returned to the same bustling street, his presence unassuming as ever. He chose to walk this time, carrying nothing but a small notebook in his hand. The air was cooler now, the streetlights casting soft glows over the sidewalks. As he passed by a cafe, he spotted an elderly man struggling to carry a stack of newspapers. Without hesitation, David stepped forward, his hand reaching out to steady the pile. "Let me help you," David said, his voice gentle. The elderly man looked up, startled at first, but his expression softened when he saw David's kind smile. "Oh, thank you," he said gratefully. "My back isn't what it used to be." David took the newspapers and walked with the man to a small stand a few steps away. After arranging them neatly, he turned back to the man and offered a polite nod. "Take care of yourself," David said before continuing on his way. The elderly man watched him leave, a faint smile spreading across his face. It wasn't the act of carrying the newspapers that touched him. It was the quiet kindness in David's gesture, the way he offered help without expecting anything in return. Further down the street, David noticed a woman sitting on a bench, her head bowed as she scrolled through her phone. Her posture seemed familiar, and as he drew closer, he realized it was Elena. Her shopping bags were gone, replaced by a simple leather purse resting beside her. She looked up as David approached, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with unspoken thoughts. "You came back," Elena said finally, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. David nodded. "I often do," he replied. "This street has a way of teaching people things they didn't expect to learn." Elena hesitated, then gestured to the empty spot on the bench beside her. David sat down, his calm presence making the silence feel less heavy. "I've been thinking," Elena said, her voice halting, "about what you said earlier, about how we treat others." David turned to her, his gaze steady but kind. "And?" he prompted gently. "I don't think I've ever really thought about it before," she admitted. "I've always been focused on myself, on what I want, what I think I deserve. But today?" She trailed off, her eyes dropping to her hands. David waited patiently, giving her the space to find her words. "Today, I realized how small that way of thinking really is," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "and how much I've missed by not seeing people for who they are." David's faint smile returned. "It's not an easy thing to recognize," he said, "but the fact that you have is a step in the right direction." Elena looked at him, her expression tinged with a vulnerability she hadn't shown before. "Why do you do it?" she asked. "Why sit out here and let people judge you like that?" David leaned back slightly, his gaze turning thoughtful. "Because judgment reveals more about the person making it than the one receiving it," he said. "And because kindness, true kindness, only shows itself when there's no expectation of reward." Elena was silent for a long moment, absorbing his words. "I test people," David continued, his voice calm and even, "not to humiliate them or prove a point, but to understand, to see how we as a society view those who appear to have less, and to remind myself that no matter how much I have, I'm not above anyone else." Elena nodded slowly, her earlier arrogance replaced by quiet introspection. She thought about her actions that day, the way she had dismissed David without a second thought, and the sting of shame returned. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly, "for the way I treated you. It was wrong." David looked at her, his expression softening. "Apologies are important," he said, "but what matters more is what you do next, how you choose to treat people moving forward." Elena nodded again, this time with more conviction. As David stood to leave, a young woman passing by stopped and offered him a bottle of water. "It's a warm evening," she said with a kind smile. "Take care of yourself." David accepted the bottle with a grateful nod. "Thank you," he said warmly. The interaction was simple, almost unremarkable, but Elena watched it unfold with a sense of awe. It was the kind of kindness she had often overlooked in her pursuit of wealth and status, and seeing it now left her feeling both humbled and inspired. As David walked away, Elena remained on the bench, her thoughts swirling. The noise of the street seemed distant, the world around her fading into the background as she reflected on the day's events. For the first time in a long time, Elena felt a spark of something she hadn't realized she was missing, a sense of connection, not to wealth or power, but to the simple humanity that tied everyone together. She stood up, her steps lighter than before, and began walking down the street, the lessons of the day etched into her heart. As the camera metaphorically shifts to the audience, what would you do if you were in Elena's shoes? Have you ever experienced kindness in unexpected ways? Share your story in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about how small acts of kindness can make a big difference. And with that, the story ends, but its impact lingers, a quiet reminder of the power of kindness and humility.